There are paintings that show Christ in majesty, in suffering, or in quiet resignation. And then there are paintings that capture something even more unsettling, the moment when cruelty turns into spectacle. The mocking of Christ belongs to that disturbing tradition. It is not only a religious image, it is a study of humiliation made public. It shows the instant when pain is no longer enough for the crowd, and suffering must be turned into ridicule. That is what makes the subject so powerful. It is not simply about violence, it is about contempt. At first, the scene may seem familiar to anyone who has seen Christian art. Christ stands or sits surrounded by a robe may be draped around him in cruel imitation of royal dignity. A reed may be placed in his hand as a false scepter. A crown of thorns may press into his head. Faces lean close. Hands strike, gesture, or point. The atmosphere is tense, theatrical, and deeply human in the worst possible sense. This is not an image of battle. It is an image of a crowd enjoying the degradation of someone already powerless. That is one of the reasons the subject remains so emotionally strong across centuries. The mocking of Christ is not only a biblical episode, it is one of the clearest visual representations of how people behave when they want to strip another human being of dignity before destroying them. The violence here is physical, but it is also psychological. The tormentors do not merely wound the body. They attack identity, worth, and sacredness. They turn a man into an object of performance. In doing so, they reveal something deeply uncomfortable about human cruelty. People do not always hurt others, only to defeat them. Sometimes they hurt them to enjoy their helplessness. To understand why this subject became so important in art, we need to begin with its place in the Passion narrative. After Christ is arrested and condemned, he is handed over to soldiers who mock him as King of the Jews. This mockery is full of bitter irony. The one Christians believe to be the true king is treated as a joke king. The one they believe to be divine is humiliated in the most public and degrading way possible. The moment becomes spiritually powerful because everything is reversed. Glory is hidden under shame. Kingship is mocked through costume. Truth is surrounded by lies, and innocence stands at the center of a circle of contempt. That reversal is what gives the image its depth. On the surface, the scene is about weakness. Christ appears surrounded, outnumbered, and physically vulnerable. But beneath that surface lies a more profound tension. In Christian belief, the mocked figure is not defeated in the ultimate sense. He is enduring humiliation without surrendering identity. The soldiers believe they are exposing powerlessness, but religious art often suggests they are exposing their own blindness instead. They do not recognize what stands before them. Their mockery reveals not Christ's emptiness, but their failure to see. This is why painters return to the subject again and again. The scene allowed them to explore several powerful ideas at once. It offered physical drama, emotional contrast, and theological meaning. It placed serenity against aggression, innocence against mockery, silence against noise, and spiritual dignity against human ugliness. Few biblical moments give artists such a concentrated conflict of inner and outer worlds. Christ often appears calm or sorrowful, while everything around him erupts into cruelty. That contrast becomes the emotional center of the work. What makes the scene especially disturbing is that it is built around performance. The tormentors are not only attacking, they are staging an imitation of kingship. The robe, the reed, the crown, the gestures of false reverence. All of these details turn humiliation into theater. The crowd creates a dark parody of ceremony. Instead of a coronation, there is a degradation. Instead of honor, there is ridicule. Instead of reverence, there is mock homage. This theatrical cruelty is one reason the subject still feels modern. It shows how power often humiliates before it destroys. It uses spectacle as a weapon. Artists who painted the mocking of Christ often understood that the emotional power of the scene depended on faces. The expression of Christ becomes crucial. Either signed, sorrowful, serene, wounded, or silent in a way that seems beyond words. Around him, the tormentors may grin, sneer, shout, or lean in with aggressive energy. Those faces create a moral contrast more powerful than any written explanation. One face bears suffering. The others manufacture it. The difference between them becomes the painting's deepest accusation. This is also why the composition of such works is often crowded and intimate. The tormentors close in. Space disappears. Christ is trapped inside a ring of bodies, hands, weapons, and expressions. The viewer feels the pressure of the scene, not from grand landscape or distant symbolism, but from proximity. Humiliation happens close. It invades personal space. It strips away privacy and turns one person into a target before witnesses. In many depictions, this closeness is what makes the image so hard to forget. The cruelty is not abstract, it is face-to-face. The subject also gave artists an opportunity to explore one of the oldest and darkest tensions in human culture, the relationship between power and vulnerability. Outwardly, the soldiers have all the control. They are armed, united, and physically dominant. Christ is bound, wounded, and isolated. Yet spiritually, the scene often suggests the opposite. The mockers appear strong only because they do not understand what strength is. Their power depends on force, numbers, and ridicule. Christ's power, in contrast, is shown through endurance. He does not need to dominate the room to become its moral center. In fact, his silence often condemns the noise around him more deeply than any spoken response could. That moral inversion is one of the reasons the image remains central in Christian visual culture. It teaches not only through narrative, but through contradiction. The mocked king is the true king. The humiliated figure becomes the bearer of dignity. The men performing strength expose their own spiritual smallness. Art is uniquely suited to this paradox, because it can freeze the moment before its meaning is fully understood. The viewer sees humiliation first, then gradually recognizes the deeper structure beneath it. But even beyond theology, the mocking of Christ continues to resonate because it captures something universal about human behavior. Crowds often become cruel in ways individuals alone might not. Public humiliation has always been one of the favorite tools of power. To laugh at the vulnerable, to dress suffering in ridicule, to turn another person into an object for spectacle. These are not ancient instincts that disappeared with biblical history. They remain painfully recognizable. That is part of why the subject still feels alive. It is sacred, but it is also psychological and social. It shows a pattern of cruelty that repeats throughout history. In many great depictions of this subject, Christ becomes the still point in a storm of mockery. Everything around him is movement, aggression, and noise. He alone remains composed, or at least inwardly gathered. That stillness is not weakness. It becomes a form of resistance. The tormentors can strike him, dress him in parody, and attempt to reduce him to a joke, but they cannot fully possess what he is. This is where the scene becomes more than an episode of suffering. It becomes a confrontation between humiliation and unbroken identity. That is why the mocking of Christ remains one of the most emotionally charged themes in religious art. It does not simply show pain. It shows pain turned into entertainment. It shows dignity under assault. It shows the terrifying creativity of cruelty and the strange, almost unbearable power of silent endurance in the middle of it. What makes the mocking of Christ so powerful is not only the cruelty of the subject, but the precise kind of cruelty it reveals. This is not violence in the chaos of war, where bodies collide and destruction can be explained through conflict. It is violence that has become written. The tormentors do not merely injure Christ. They create a ceremony of humiliation around him. They costume him, gesture toward him, and transform pain into spectacle. That is what makes the scene so disturbing. It is not simply an attack on the body. It is an attack on dignity staged for witnesses. This distinction matters because humiliation works differently from physical violence alone. A wound to the body can be hidden, treated, or remembered privately. Humiliation demands an audience. It depends on display. In the biblical scene, the mockers want more than domination. They want performance. They want Christ to appear ridiculous, powerless, laughable. They create a parody of kingship precisely because the point is not only to hurt him, but to redefine him in public. They want to erase the meaning of who he is and replace it with an image of helplessness. That is why the robe, the reed, and the crown are so important in artistic depictions of the subject. These objects are not ordinary props. They are symbols of mock sovereignty. A robe that should suggest honor becomes an instrument of ridicule. A reed that should be meaningless is transformed into a fake scepter. A crown becomes a source of pain. The genius of the tormentors lies in their perverse understanding that symbols matter. They do not simply deny Christ's kingship. They stage a false version of it in order to degrade the real one. This gives the scene its bitter theatrical irony. For artists, That irony created extraordinary possibilities. The subject allows the painter to build a composition around opposites. Christ is often quiet, while the mockers are animated. He may appear still while the others lean, strike, shout, or sneer. His face may be solemn or wounded while the faces around him are twisted with aggression or amusement. The visual contrast becomes the emotional heart of the image. One figure absorbs the violence. The others generate it. One center holds. The circle around him breaks itself apart through noise and contempt. This contrast is especially powerful because it allows the painting to explore silence as a form of meaning. In many depictions, Christ does not resist outwardly. He does not return insult for insult. He does not seize power or shatter the scene with force. Instead, his silence becomes unbearable for the viewer. It is the silence of someone who sees more than the crowd does. The mockers want to define the moment through their laughter and violence, but art often suggests that their noise cannot finally control its meaning. The more they perform their cruelty, the more clearly they reveal themselves. That revelation is one of the deepest themes in the subject. The soldiers believe they are humiliating Christ, but in many great paintings, their actions end up exposing their own moral poverty. Their gestures are full of movement, but not of greatness. Their energy is theatrical, but spiritually empty. They appear strong only because they possess temporary physical power. The painting invites the viewer to recognize that true dignity does not belong to the ones who dominate the room. It belongs to the one who endures without becoming like his tormentors. This is also why the subject has remained so compelling across different artistic periods. Medieval, Renaissance, Baroque, and later artists could all approach it differently, yet the emotional structure remained potent. Some emphasized sorrow, some emphasized brutality, some made Christ serene and idealized. Others made the tormentors grotesque and psychologically intense. Some crowded the figures into a claustrophobic space. Others opened the composition slightly to increase theatricality. But in every case, the same central drama remained: the collision between sacred dignity and public degradation. The scene can also be read in a wider human sense, beyond Christian theology, even for viewers who do not approach it devotionally. The mocking of Christ presents a timeless pattern. Groups often become cruel by transforming another person into an object of entertainment. Mockery creates a false sense of superiority. It binds the crowd together by isolating the victim. That dynamic is ancient, but it remains recognizable in every era. Public humiliation has always been one of the easiest ways to demonstrate power. The scene therefore survives not only because of religion, but because it reveals something painfully permanent about human behavior. Another reason the subject remains so strong is that it exists at the edge of visibility and conscience. The viewer is placed in a difficult position. To look at the painting is to become a witness to humiliation. The question then arises: what kind of witness? Are we simply observers, safely outside the scene, or are we meant to feel implicated by the human tendencies? The painting exposes great depictions of the mocking of Christ do not allow the viewer complete innocence. They force a confrontation not only with what happened to Christ, but with the universal human capacity to degrade what is vulnerable. This moral pressure is often intensified by the way artists handle closeness. The tormentors do not stand far away. They invade Christ's space. Hands reach toward him. Faces come near. Tools of ridicule are pressed against the body. This closeness makes the violence feel intimate and invasive. Humiliation is always most powerful when it destroys the boundary between the self and the hostile crowd. The victim is denied the right to remain inwardly untouched. That is what the mockers seek, not husbane, but invasion of personhood. And yet, in many of the greatest versions of the subject, they fail. They succeed physically, but not spiritually. Christ remains wounded, mocked, and isolated, but not emptied. Something in him resists ridicule. That resistance is often expressed through the eyes, the mouth, the posture, or the inward gravity of the figure. Even when bruised and dressed in parody, he remains the moral center of the image. The crowd controls the action, but not the truth of the scene. This is why the theme carries such emotional force. It presents humiliation at its most severe, but also suggests that humiliation does not always succeed in destroying identity. The artist's treatment of light can also transform the meaning of the scene. When Christ is illuminated more clearly than the figures around him, the painting suggests not merely visibility, but revelation. Light can separate innocence from cruelty, stillness from agitation, and meaning from chaos. The mockers may believe they are dominating the room, yet the artist quietly gives Christ the presence that endures. This is one of the most subtle ways religious art overturns appearances. The crowd may own the moment, but the image belongs to the mocked one. That is why the mocking of Christ continues to move viewers so deeply. It is not only a scene of suffering, it is a scene of theatrical cruelty, public contempt, and moral inversion. It shows how easily humans can gather around degradation, but also how dignity can remain mysteriously intact under assault. The image becomes unforgettable because it captures both the ugliness of humiliation and the strange strength of endurance. The lasting power of the mocking of Christ comes from the fact that it is never only a biblical scene from the distant past. It begins in Scripture, but it continues to speak because it captures a pattern of human cruelty that never fully disappears. Public humiliation, collective mockery, the enjoyment of another person's powerlessness. These are not confined to one century, one empire, or one religious story. They belong to a darker side of human behavior that repeats itself throughout history. That is why the image remains so haunting. It is sacred, but it is also painfully recognizable. One reason the subject has endured so strongly in art is that it combines physical suffering with moral revelation. Many images of violence show what happens to the body. The mocking of Christ goes further. It shows what happens when violence tries to enter the realm of meaning itself. The tormentors do not simply want Christ to bleed. They want him to appear ridiculous. They want to redefine him through shame. They want to make his identity collapse in front of witnesses. That effort gives the scene its psychological depth. The question is no longer only whether the victim survives the blow. The question becomes whether dignity can survive degradation. In great depictions of the subject, the answer is yes, but not in any easy or sentimental way. Christ is not untouched. He suffers. He is surrounded. He is made vulnerable before a hostile crowd. Yet something in him remains unbroken. That is the mystery at the center of the image. Outwardly, everything suggests defeat. Inwardly, the painting often suggests an inviolable core. This is why the scene has such emotional intensity. It stages the moment when humiliation reaches its height, and yet fails to fully possess the person it targets. That idea gives the image enormous spiritual force, but it also makes it powerful for viewers beyond strictly devotional contexts. Even outside theology, people recognize the importance of that distinction. Human beings can be mocked, isolated, misrepresented, and publicly diminished, yet still retain something essential. The image therefore becomes larger than religion alone. It becomes a meditation on the limits of cruelty. Cruelty can wound, expose, and invade, but it cannot always destroy the deepest truth of the person before it. That is one of the reasons the subject continues to resonate so strongly. At the same time, the painting does not let the viewer escape into admiration too quickly. Before it becomes inspiring, it remains disturbing. The crowd matters. The mocking faces matter. The gestures of false reverence matter. They force us to confront the social nature of humiliation. The tormentors are not acting in solitude. They form a group. Their cruelty is reinforced by performance. One man alone may hesitate, but a crowd often discovers new energy in shared contempt. That insight gives the subject lasting relevance. It is not only about cruelty from above, it is about cruelty amplified by collective participation. This is why the mocking of Christ can feel so modern. The details may belong to the ancient passion narrative, but the emotional mechanism is familiar in every age. Public shaming, ridicule disguised as entertainment, the transformation of vulnerability into spectacle. These things remain deeply recognizable. The painting continues to move viewers because it reveals something essential about how power works when it wants not only obedience, but humiliation. It wants the victim seen in a broken form. It wants the crowd involved. It wants dignity replaced by caricature. And yet the image never leaves the crowd with the last word. In many great representations of the theme, Christ's stillness becomes more powerful the longer one looks. At first, the eye may be drawn to the movement around him, the gestures, the aggression, the costume of mock royalty. But gradually, the center shifts. The mocked figure begins to dominate the emotional space. The tormentors become noisy, temporary, almost spiritually hollow. Christ, though wounded and silent, becomes the figure of gravity. The painting quietly reorders the room. What looked like weakness becomes presence. What looked like power becomes exposure. This reversal is one of the deepest achievements of the subject. It does not deny suffering, but it changes the meaning of victory. The crowd wins the surface of the scene, but not its moral truth. In Tissent, the mocking of Christ becomes one of the great visual meditations on false power. It asks, what kind of strength depends on numbers, noise, and ridicule? It asks, what kind of kingship must be mocked, because it cannot be understood? And it asks, what remains of a person when everything external has been stripped away? Artists were drawn again and again to this subject because it gave them a way to paint the collision between outer humiliation and inner endurance. That collision is timeless. It appears in religion, politics, history, and ordinary human life. People are often tested not only by pain, but by contempt. The fear of being laughed at, publicly diminished, or turned into an object before others can be as powerful as the fear of physical harm. The mocking of Christ understands that. It understands that humiliation can be a form of domination deeper than the blow itself. Another reason the subject remains unforgettable is that it places the viewer in a morally unstable role. We are looking at a scene of humiliation. That means we are part of its audience. The painting, therefore, asks something uncomfortable. Are we merely observing suffering, or are we being asked to examine the human appetite for watching it? Great works on this theme often create that tension deliberately. They do not allow the viewer to remain pure spectator. They force a confrontation with the desire to look, the discomfort of looking, and the responsibility of understanding what is being shown. That tension is part of what makes the subject so rich in art history. It is theological, emotional, psychological, and social, all at once. It reveals the cruelty of the tormentors, but it also reveals the vulnerability of all human dignity in the presence of power. And then, against all that darkness, it presents a strange and unforgettable possibility. A person may be humiliated and still not become what the crowd says he is. A person may be reduced outwardly and still remain inwardly whole. That possibility gives the image its deepest strength. That is why the mocking of Christ remains one of the most emotionally powerful themes in religious art. Not simply because it shows suffering, not simply because it reveals cruelty, but because it captures the terrifying moment when shame is used as a weapon, and then shows that even such a weapon has limits. It can wound the body, surround the victim, and command the crowd, but it cannot always destroy the truth of the one it targets. Once seen in that way, the image does not leave quietly. The robe, the rid, the crown, the mocking faces, the silence at the center, all of it stays in the mind. The subject endures because it is about more than one biblical episode. It is about the relationship between spectacle and cruelty, vulnerability and identity, humiliation and unbroken dignity. That is what gives it such lasting force. And that is the final achievement of the mocking of Christ. It turns a moment of public degradation into a permanent image of human cruelty and moral endurance. It shows how easily people can gather around shame, but also how difficult it can be to destroy true dignity once it is rooted beyond the reach of the crowd.